You are listening to CHISPA Chats, brought to you by Equality New Mexico's Nathan Saavedra and Leila Garcia. EQNM is a statewide advocacy organization leading the fight for queer and trans liberation. Thanks for being with us.
I'm Marshall Martinez, Chief Liberation Officer at Equality New Mexico, and I'm here with my good friend Adrien Lawyer, Co-Executive Director at the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. Thanks for joining us, Adrien.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm the Chief Liberation Officer, Executive Director of Equality New Mexico, been doing political advocacy work for more years than I like to share with people in public spaces. As you've heard me say before, Adrien, I come to this work from a community organizing background and have been really excited to work at a place where my identity is at the forefront of my work as a queer person. And I know a little bit about your history and TGRC, but I would love for you to just tell folks that are listening a little bit about who you are and what TGRC is and does.
Yeah, for sure. I was born in 1970, and I feel like I was some part of LGBTQ from the time I was a little child, When I was 2, I feel like I knew I was a boy. My family tells stories about me that make it clear that I was really different. Something was different about my gender, and certainly my gender expression when I was really little in the early 1970s, so it really stuck out to them. So I grew up not knowing how to talk about what I am, who I am, and what I am, but knowing that I was definitely different and that something was going on with me. As a young person in the lesbian communities, I did just real community level activism. I was in Tallahassee, Florida, and Memphis, Tennessee when I was young, and then I really just moved into trying to figure out how to have a job. And my degree that I was finishing at Florida State was in education. And so I wanted to work with kids, but I was so butch presenting in the mid 90s when I got that degree that it was really hard for me to find a job working with elementary school age kids in the Florida Panhandle where I was. And then I moved out here and was a substitute teacher a little bit, and then got into a horrible car accident. Went on to some just corporate jobs, just trying to have health insurance and a paycheck, and then started my own transition medically in '04. And then within about, 3 years of that had started the center. And by started the center, I mean, I started to show up at things calling myself the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico at stuff like the CPAG meeting, the HIV planning community committee. And just trying to start getting involved and figure out how to form an organization around the idea that we were having about having one.
I love that. And I still to this day love hearing you say to folks, I started showing up calling myself the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico. And I vaguely remember those days being in similar spaces, right? We've been activists and advocates in this community for a long time together, long since before I came back around to EQNM. But I love hearing that story, and then now being able to say to folks, Equality New Mexico has an office and it's in the Transgender Resource Center. And that's not the trunk of Adrien's car. It's a whole building in downtown Albuquerque, and it's this phenomenal space. So there is something to be said for manifesting things by showing up and saying, this is who I am. And someday it'll become who I actually am.
You got to believe it. You got to believe it.
I love that. Well, thanks so much for making some time to chat today. I know we could talk about our coming out experiences and all of that all day long, but I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you about data privacy and why it's an LGBTQ issue, and I think when I think back to a year or so, about a year ago, when data privacy started to really bubble up to the forefront of an issue for EQNM, for me, I always thought about data privacy as this consumer protection topic. Mm-hmm. I thought about the way that individual consumers need to be protected from things they don't fully know or understand, which is why we have stickers on blow dryers that say don't use in the shower or those sorts of things, right? I think about the things that protect consumers. And then I started to really dig into this understanding at that time with all the gender affirming care bans starting to really take hold in other states. And, a year into all of the abortion bans starting to go into effect in those states. And what somebody said to me was, the thing about data privacy and the thing about criminalizing healthcare like abortion care, gender affirming care, is that you can only prosecute someone for something that you have evidence of. And data is the evidence that they need. And that was just a really mind-blowing moment for me and really an exciting opportunity to take something away from this sort of whitewashed, moderated consumer protection lens and say no, this is actually it is all of that, but it's actually really about the safety of our community.
Yes. And LGBTQ communities and immigrant communities, and the way that those dovetail too, the LGBT immigrant people, right? And all of the movement that people make in states like New Mexico, all of
Yeah,
the back and forth, right?
yeah,
That's exactly
absolutely.
right.
And I love, something that our organizations have been aligned with all of this time and have continuously, said is that the way we say it at EQNM is like, we don't do LGBTQ policy work and help immigrants. LGBTQ people are immigrants, right? Like, we know that trans folks are immigrants, and in many cases, they're immigrants to this country because they're queer and trans.
Exactly.
And do you all have experiences like that at the resource center, that you've engaged with folks who immigrated for those reasons?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a transgender unit at the Immigration Detention Center out in Grants at Cibola, at the Cibola facility for about 2.5 years before they dispersed those women all over the country just due to the quality of the medical care at the facility. So it wasn't political as far as we could understand. It really just was that they couldn't continue to hold them there because they didn't actually believe they were getting the right medical care. So, but for 2.5 years, they held trans women mainly in a single unit together. And we were out there once a month, visiting and providing commissary support and just doing some liaising, between them and the administration there. So it was really interesting. And almost every one of them were asylum seekers from Central America, coming just due to being trans.
Yeah,
State violence and interpersonal violence, both.
absolutely. And we know that it's probably only that much worse now in this current political climate, right? And you had talked about just the sort of fluidity, the mobility, I think, of folks, especially in New Mexico. And one of the first conversations I think that you and I had about data privacy was around folks who are getting legal, protected, gender affirming care in New Mexico. And what it means to not have their data sort of protected. Can you tell us just a little bit about what went through your head at that time, what you started thinking about as we had those conversations?
I think for me, I had that same kind of like mind blown moment that you were describing earlier about this not being a consumer protection issue. Because when I think about data privacy for patients, I think about HIPAA. And I'm thinking about the subpoenaing of the records, the medical records of trans patients who are minors, and as we've seen some of that trend happen where there's a demand to produce the medical records of these young patients. And I'm thinking, like, how do we help to shore up, HIPAA in a way that hospitals and clinics know they don't have to produce those records, and in fact legally they're ordered not to produce those records, right? So I'm so busy thinking about HIPAA that I wasn't thinking about what we then started to talk about, which is when the families come over for their doctor visit, they also eat at restaurants and use their credit card or fill up the car with gas or whatever they're doing. They post on Facebook to say, loved the green chili cheeseburger we ate for lunch today, and you're creating this file, your geolocation file and your spending file that proves you were in a place at a time, right? All of these things. It also, when I think about folks who have immigrated, you think about the ability to predict where someone's going to be based on this information and try to pick them up, to try to arrest people or intimidate people by being where you know that they will be based on the data you were able to procure about where they have been, where they go.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, both of us were having that moment almost parallel of sort of starting to think through. And then, I know you and I are very similar. I then started to go down this whole rabbit hole of all of the scenarios, but we've talked about this. I was born and raised in Alamogordo, New Mexico. My dad's family is in Las Cruces. El Paso, Texas was the big city that we went shopping in, and it's the first city I learned how to drive in, right? Alamogordo didn't really count. And so my cousins took me to El Paso and taught me how to drive. And you're welcome, Albuquerque, for whatever that means, because sometimes I drive like I'm from El Paso. But we know that like these state borders don't really mean anything for folks, right? When you live in Las Cruces, you're in El Paso all the time. When you live in Gallup, you're in Window Rock all the time, right? When you live in Farmington, you're in Durango, and vice versa. And the thing that, that keeps coming up to mind for me is that it's not just the geolocation data and that stuff, and the medical record stuff, but it's as simple as what you search for on Google on your phone and then the immediate ads that you get later. And so I used Google, not surprisingly, last week, the holiday, with my mom. We have a couple of things in common. So I was searching for recipes for the new Crown Royal chocolate flavor that just came out. Because that's whiskey is something me and my mom have in common. We saw it, bought it, and thought, so I Googled the recipe of what's a good thing to mix this chocolate flavored whiskey with. And I got on Facebook this morning with my coffee and I had 6 ads for Crown Royal on Facebook. And so that clear connection, right? And so then my head went to, what if I was a parent searching for a chest binder for my trans teenager, right? What if
Or a tucking bathing suit, you're trying to help your little daughter be able to go swimming,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, all of those things. And I thought I am pretty sure that had she had it available to her, my mom would have just Googled books to support my gay son. So I would imagine the parent of every trans child, who is trying to be a good parent, is the first thing they do is get on Amazon or Google to look for, what book can I read to be a decent parent to my kid?
Exactly. Or where is there a support group, or is there a resource center? How do I get help? What do I do? My child is trans. How do I help them? Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then that data is going to follow those folks, right? And so then, like you said, between the spending profile and the geolocation profile and the Google searches we've made, somebody knows that those parents with that kid, they're New Mexican, they've lived here their whole lives, they're getting their healthcare here in New Mexico, they're going into El Paso to go shop for school clothes or to go see cousins or whatever. And Texas, which has severely criminalized gender affirming care for young people, might have law enforcement waiting for them based on these data profiles.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
I know you also connect with a lot of the providers, right? So many of us go to TGRC to find out not only who provides gender affirming care. I, on more than one occasion have gone to y'all to be like, who's a good general primary care, practitioner, right? And so what are your conversations with healthcare providers been like around data privacy?
I mean, I think everybody's just so deeply terrified, when they're seeing huge medical systems and academic systems being threatened and coerced. It's just really hard to think about how to protect yourself. I feel this way even, but I think providers even more so just have never been told things like, don't use your work email to communicate about this or that, and creating email chains back and forth that can be IPRA'd, that can be requested, and just not even thinking about protecting data in the first place, because that's not the world that we've lived in, around this type of care. You haven't had to be self-protective in that way as this type of provider until now. And once you think about data privacy, it's too late. We create these files on ourselves every single day. And by the time you're like, oh, maybe I should turn off the location on my phone, it's like you've already had it on for years and years and years. It's kind of done,
Yeah. I think about that all the time. We are constantly, I know you all are also constantly getting digital security reminders for our organizations, for, all of those things. And I always think to myself, I probably should do this for myself, not just for the organization, right? And then a memory from Facebook pops up this morning that was like, this is what you posted 14 years ago today. I was telling everybody where I was, what I was doing, what I was eating, who I was with. And it was all there, right? It was literally, we're recording this now on December 1st. And I, this morning, saw a post that was like, I'm having breakfast with my chosen family and I'm talking to them about World AIDS Day on this trip that we've taken. And I look at that and I'm like, I told the whole world every detail of my life in that moment. And it didn't ever occur to me that that would follow me around forever and that people would be able to access that information and use it against me. 14 years ago, I wasn't thinking about being labeled a political dissident the way I am today.
Well, especially to me, coming from a community organizer background, you were thinking of using it as an organizing tool. I'm raising awareness. World AIDS Day, I'm talking about how families come in all shapes and sizes. I'm empowering queer people by sharing my experiences so that they know that they're valid. There's so much stuff. Like, I don't know how much I love Facebook and posting on Facebook personally, but I do share things and repost things and post things because I know that sometimes there are younger trans people looking at me to see if they're okay and if they could grow to be the age I am, and like sometimes just to even share something like I'm having breakfast is like I'm a human being. I'm living, I'm thriving, I have for the relationships, I have family. Here's a picture of all of us. We weren't thinking of it in terms of safety. We were thinking of it in terms of outreach or engagement with community.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. One of the things that a friend of mine, longtime friend, I think that as well, who's done communications work for reproductive justice organizations in the past, I had gone to her and talked to her a little bit about this and said, I really want to think about the messaging around this. And the first thing she said is, I want to be really clear about what we're doing with this policy. The internet is a liberation tool for queer and trans people who have been isolated for generations. And I was also it was another one of those light bulb moments of like, yeah, I was a queer kid in Alamogordo, New Mexico. The internet didn't really exist, not the way it does today, right? We had the dial-up, situation, and we couldn't be on it very often. And I was very isolated. I thought I was the only person like me for a very long time. And so that was another one of those moments where I started to get really depressed that I was like, of course, these systems would take this tool that finally gave us community across geography and find a way to use it against us.
You think of rural folks, you think of like native folks, on reservations. And I think about, we know there's a very high prevalence of autism spectrum brain differences among trans and non binary youth. So, right now, at least today, we have incredibly high engagement on Discord and less so when events are in person. And it's not that nobody comes, but there's still a lot of hesitation around in-person events and gatherings. But Discord feels so comfortable and safe. And the youth in particular, the 13 to 19 group, are in there just sharing and sharing and sharing on Discord. And it's like, of course, like that's just what you said. Finally, not just are there people like me, but they're together in a place where I feel safe to interact with them and don't have to maybe look people in the eye or, whatever, be judged for anything that I do that's different, So it's amazing. We've seen that be, again, once more, a liberation tool. It happens over and over in so many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it just makes me so frustrated to know that the folks who are always out there to get us are going to use every tool they can, even the ones that should be ours.
That we need.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the internet is exceptionally queer and it should always be that.
I agree.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that, we talked about this earlier a little bit around the immigration piece, but something that I saw, it was shared with me from the Brennan Center report this morning, is that ICE has publicly stated that they are going to continue to use what they are calling their super spy mechanisms. And they openly state that social media and data collection from online shopping, et cetera, is available to ICE to use, largely because those corporations, those big tech companies, not only do they not stand up for us, but they don't even wait for a warrant or a subpoena or anything. They just happily hand and my thought immediately just went to, again, the number of undocumented folks in our communities who are here because they came for asylum, and all of the different ways in which them being tracked down and detained by ICE is so many layers of this like state violence against queer and trans people, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're going to be targeted for their documentation status. It's going to be easier to find them because their social media presence, their online shopping presence indicates that they're queer, that they're trans. Then they're going to be put in a detention center where they probably aren't going to get the hormones that they've been on for a decade or more, or they may or may not get their HIV meds, right? That is always I started my advocacy in the HIV prevention world. Mm-hmm. And so that's always top of mind to me is like, are they giving folks HIV meds? And what are they saying in an immigration detention center Are they outing those people as HIV positive and queer, in these spaces? And so I think, beyond just the Texas or Arizona, it's just even that much more infuriating right now to know that all the resources of the federal government, which could be housing people or feeding people or looking for a solution to the nationwide healthcare crisis, is instead scrubbing social media platforms looking for queer brown folks.
Keeping us all safe.
That's yeah, that's right? Keeping us all safe. We are all so safe.
It's horrible. That was actually one of the issues, and this was years ago now, but that was one of the trans care was a big problem for the detainees that were in grants, but the HIV care was really one of the biggest issues that made them say we can't continue on. Like, these folks are not getting consistent care around a condition that's very much life or death. You can't fool around with your HIV meds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, I this whole conversation, lots of context for folks. But what I'm excited about is that, we're having this conversation as a series of these to really let folks know CHISPA is what we've been calling it, right? It's the Community and Health Information Safety and Protection Act. Bit of a mouthful there. But, once again, New Mexico leading the way, we introduced the strongest data privacy legislation in the country last year, and we didn't quite get it over the finish line in our state legislature, but we're working right now and building right now to bring it back in this upcoming legislative session, and hopefully get that done.
Right. That's right. We can do it.
We can. We absolutely can. I think if anybody can lead the nation on the really good stuff, it's New Mexico. We've been doing it for a while.
You know it.
But and I've just been continuously excited, just sort of looping us back around to the fact that strong data privacy protections haven't passed in a lot of states, I think in large part because they've been talked about as consumer protection.
Exactly.
We're the first state where, frankly, the big tech companies have gotten really frightened because we're saying that this is community protection, right? It's immigrants, it's trans folks, it's people who seek reproductive health care. And so we're changing the game for them in a way that I don't think they're ready for.
Yep. Totally.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to be in that fight with you. I know you and I could talk for hours about this and everything else, without a doubt. But thanks for making some time to join us today. And we are just a little over a month away from the beginning of this legislative session when we're going to go rattle some cages and cause some good trouble in the state legislature.
We're going to at least move this ball down the field. That's for sure.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time, Adrien. I appreciate it. As always, it's great to talk to you.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of CHISPA Chats. Learn more and take action now at nmchispa.org. Sign our petition, share this podcast with your friends and family, and remember, we got us. Equality New Mexico is honored to be joined by a number of New Mexico-based and national organizations who have all stood together to share the important and crucial need for strong, community-based data privacy protections. We work in coalition with Bold Futures New Mexico, the ACLU of New Mexico, Progress Now New Mexico, the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico, Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains, Conservation Voters New Mexico, GLSEN New Mexico, the New Mexico Status on the Commission of Women, New Mexico Dream Team, FYI Plus, and Common Cause New Mexico.